Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Yellow Tape. My name is Julian. This is Nitty. Thank you guys for being here again. And today we have a really interesting episode, a really informal episode. And I will let Nitty tell you about our special guest.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us at Beyond the Yellow Tape. Today, we have a really interesting episode on archaeology and anthropology and how that ties up with forensic science. And Professor Kimberlee Moran is going to share with us how these different fields come together and help us in crimes investigation. So without further ado, let's dig in.
All right. And right before that, guys, don't forget to like,
share and subscribe.
And let's get into it. So, episode time.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have with us Miss Kimberlee Moran, and I know her personally because she's the associate professor and director of the forensic science program at Rutgers University. She also has her educational background in forensic archaeology. And is very diverse in a lot of fields such as forensic anthropology, crimes in consulting. So we are really excited to sit and speak with her more about and learn more about forensic archaeology and anthropology. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Right.
Welcome once again, Professor Moran. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nitty. I'm so happy to be here.
As the introduction was that you are so diverse and knowledgeable in forensic archaeology and forensic anthropology, the first question, of course, that comes to my mind is, what is the difference between forensic archaeology and anthropology, if you don't mind us explaining?
Sure. Yes, this is something that is very, very near and dear to my heart. So first of all, just for a little bit of context, how we practice forensic anthropology in the United States is very different to how it's practiced in many other countries. So in the United States, whenever we talk about the field of anthropology as a whole, anthropology is all about the study of humans or humanity. And in the United States, we have something called the four-field approach. So within the larger field of anthropology, there are four kind of subdisciplines as it's practiced in the United States. So first of all, we have cultural anthropology. That's all to do with human culture, religion, rituals, practices, things like that. Then we have archaeology. Archaeology is all about the humans of the past. And that includes their language and their culture and the stuff that they make and all manner of things. But it's humans of the past. Then we have physical or bioanthropology. And that has to do with the physical structure of humans, so their bones. And often human evolution as well. How did human structures evolve from primates and Neanderthals to the modern humans that we have today? And then our last field within that four-field approach is linguistics, and that's all about human language and human communication. So anthropology in the US, encapsulates those four areas. Whereas in other countries, those four areas are often their own specific disciplines, and they don't necessarily fall under anthropology. So you will have a department of archaeology separate from departments of anthropology in other countries. Here, it'll all be under one department. So that really kind of dictates some of these fields as they apply to the forensic world. So in the United States, forensic anthropology kind of does everything that has to do with dead bodies, excavating them, analyzing the human remains, all that kind of stuff. In other countries, they see forensic anthropology and archaeology as being very different fields. And for better or for worse, I was trained in the United Kingdom, so I very much was brought up in this kind of separate but equal sort of philosophy that these are separate disciplines that complement each other. And there is some natural overlap, but they very much do their own thing. So in other jurisdictions, forensic anthropology is just human bones. So these individuals work in a laboratory. Oftentimes they work closely with medical examiners, and they're dealing with bodies that are skeletal remains, and they are doing what's called the biological profile. And what that means is you're looking at a set of remains, you're trying to determine the sex of the individual, you're trying to determine the age at death, you're trying to determine whether there are any signs of pathology, trauma, diseases of the bones, that sort of stuff. You're looking at the stature of the individual, how tall they were, and you're looking at something called population affinity. So basically, what geographic part of the world did that person come from or is genetically related to? And that's the biological profile. So trying to come up with, these identity markers of an individual using the morphology of the bones. Archaeology, on the other hand, is all about the recovery aspect. And it's really synonymous with crime scene examination. So everything that we do as archaeologists, whether we're doing things forensically or in a traditional sense, our job is to respond to a scene of some kind or an archaeological site. We come up with some sort of methodology to process that site or that scene in a scientific way. We gather information, we document everything that we do, we map it, we keep meticulous records of everything that we're trying to do at that site or that scene. And then we provide some sort of interpretation as to what sort of human activity took place at that site or scene. So it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with modern human activity, i.e. a crime scene,
right,
or ancient human activity at some sort of archaeological site, that the methods are the same. And so that's how archaeology really kind of differs. It's this holistic approach. Great if we find bodies and bones, but that is not the totality of the evidence left behind by human activity.
Right.
Footwear, tool marks, blood spatter, those are all pieces of evidence that show that humans were at that site, they were doing something. What was it that they were doing? So basically, as a forensic archaeologist, I'm a version of a crime scene examiner.
That's so interesting. So when it comes to like excavation of the bodies from the sites that you probably encounter in your work, like you mentioned about footprints and blood spatters, like, would you as an archaeologist do that, or would you have a team who would work along with you as per your instructions to collect those kinds of evidence?
I mean, it would be great to have a team.
Okay.
And really, in an ideal situation, if you know that you're excavating human remains, you would want to have an archaeologist and an anthropologist working together. Okay. Because they're coming at it from completely different perspectives that are both, super important for the overall product. But the reality is that, we just don't have enough resources in forensic science generally. So oftentimes, if there's even an archaeologist involved in the first place, that's a big if. That person is usually responding as part of a crime scene unit or responding, at the request of police detectives or something like that. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that attracted me just to archaeology is the fact that it's such a multidisciplinary field. Right. You need to know so many different flavors of science to do your work well as an archaeologist. So whereas I might not be analyzing blood spatter, I have the kind of awareness of the importance of blood spatter, how that blood spatter should be documented, what the blood spatter expert will need and how they'll analyze it. So that way I can do my job properly. Right. One of the other aspects of doing forensic archaeology and kind of this outdoor scene processing is knowing how to take samples. What sort of soil samples should I be taking? What sort of bugs should I be looking for? Are there plant remains that might be useful? So I can, anticipate all the different forensic expertise that are going to happen downstream. And then my job is to make sure that I'm documenting the evidence properly, collecting and preserving the evidence properly, so that all those other aspects, other experts can be doing their work, further down the line.
Okay.
That's very interesting.
Is there any, like, I guess, examples where you might have to show up at a crime scene and use both of your anthropology brain and archaeology brain in the same case?
Sure. I mean, just human remains recovery generally. So a lot of bones look like rocks. So you kind of need to know what's a bone and what's not.
Yeah. Lime.
Yeah. So, I would, again, one of the things that you should learn in your forensic science training is where are the limitations of your expertise? What things can you truly claim that you're an expert in? So I would never claim myself to be an expert in bones. I know a lot about bones, but I know the limitations of my knowledge as well. So I would use the knowledge that I have to be able to recognize what I'm excavating, if it's bone or not. And then again, how to properly excavate it, how to package it, how to preserve it so that the actual anthropologist can do the analysis in the laboratory. but I would need to know something about bones in the first place. And I would need to know whether a bone is human or not. So I get sent lots of pictures from members of the public. They just randomly email my university with some bone that they found when they were walking their dog that day. And again, my training, it's necessary for me to know whether something is human or animal. And so I'm able to say, oh yeah, that's just, some deer bone, or, that's a cow. Once I got a cow, some cow bones. Once on campus, they were doing some pipe work. They were excavating for some pipes and they found a bone. They called me up, and yeah, it was sheep. It was a sheep bone, probably somebody's dinner. But once I did get a picture, and it was totally a human bone. It was a human pelvis, 100%. And so we had to then figure out, okay, what police force has jurisdiction over the location where this bone was found. We had to contact them and give them that information, and an investigation ensued. So sometimes pictures are human.
Oh, I'm sure. At least I'm like, with this knowledge, I guess you can definitely have help in various departments as well. So, which is preservation of crime scene, collection of samples, understanding the bones, keeping the bones, old bones intact. I'm sure it's also. So would you have any case in mind, or that you would have a really difficult situation in collecting or like preserving the crime scene for the bones that you probably were working with?
Yeah, so depending on environmental parameters, some bones are preserved better than others. So you can get bones that have been badly damaged just by, water leaching or very acidic soils. The bones of children and infants are very delicate. And when you're born, you actually have about 300 bones. So way more than you end up with as an adult, because many of those bones fuse together. So for infants, for instance, you don't have a solid skull. You just have all the individual plates of the skull. So that can be really challenging in terms of excavation. And again, the environmental factors that might impact that bone. Cremated human remains are super challenging for a whole range of different reasons. So yeah, there are definitely lots of challenging environments. Sometimes just the environment itself is difficult, if you're on a slope, or if you're potentially in contaminated soil because it's a hazardous material site. There's recently been some interesting work on landfills. Because sometimes bodies end up in dumpsters or skips, and they end up in the landfill, and then a landfill has to be excavated to try to recover the human remains. That's a horrible environment. I hope I never get called out to one of those. But the interesting thing about landfills is that it is really well documented when shipments come in and are deposited, where they're deposited in the landfill. The landfill has a form of stratigraphy of layering. So you can kind of date when those human remains were deposited, not just by the records of the landfill, but also by the things that are around that body, mail that has dates on it, or food packages that have a best by date for it, and stuff like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's crazy. I know earlier you was talking about finding like human remains, and you might try to tell the age and the sex of the human remains. About how does that, like, I guess in like simple terms for someone like me who doesn't know anything about anything, how do you like go about doing that?
Sure. So for building that biological profile where you're trying to establish the sex, the age at death, stature, things of that nature, there are metric ways that you can do that, measurements, and there's also non-metric ways. And certainly for someone like myself, if I was just doing like a really fast initial assessment on scene, you want to know if this is an adult or a juvenile or whatever, then we use those non-metric, and it's basically just the shape of the bones, certain features on the bones, morphology. So determining sex of the individual, if you're using those kind of non-metric methods, you look at the skull. There are various lumps and bumps in the skull, the angle of the jaw, the size of the chin, various things like that, that will tell you if an individual is more likely to be male or more likely to be female. Humans are on a spectrum. So you get some bones that are really robust. That's kind of the term that we have for maleness. And some bones that are really gracile. That's the kind of term for more feminine bones. But a lot of us are kind of somewhere in between. So you want to look at as many different features on the bone to kind of make that initial assessment. Same thing with the age at death. So tooth eruption is one of the main things that we use. What teeth, milk teeth or baby teeth versus adult teeth have erupted in the skull. There's some other features as well. It gets a little more tricky when you get into adult individuals unless they start losing teeth or they have teeth that wear down. Most of those tools for aging are better for individuals kind of 20 or younger. And then pathology, again, just features on the bone that are associated with certain diseases like arthritis or osteoporosis or things like that. Stature is all about measuring bones. We've got lots of different formulas where you can measure various long bones, arms and legs, and work out somebody's height when they were alive. And then finally, the population affinity. This one's a little trickier. So this is what we used to call ancestry, whether someone was of European descent or Asian descent or African descent. It's, again, we've used a lot of measurements and morphological features. We're realizing that concept of ancestry is way more complex. And just because somebody has facial features that might be more Asian, that doesn't tell you what the person actually looked like when they were alive or what skin color they had. We associate ancestry really with skin color, and there's nothing about your bones that can tell you that. So we're starting to move more towards, more into the realms of genetics. And again, kind of refining the measurements that we use principally on the skull to work out what we now are calling population affinity.
Makes sense.
So with that, is it possible to get like a decent, that's what I'm trying to say, like a decent profile just by looking at like a person's skull and I guess coming pretty close to what they may have looked like? I guess devoid of like skin color, I guess.
Yeah, so for me personally, the skull is my favorite bone or a series of bones, because it does have so much information regarding sex, regarding age at death, regarding population affinity. Like there's so much you can tell from an individual skull. But there's still so much research to be done. There's still so much that we don't know about what bones can and cannot tell us. One of the areas that is starting to kind of move away from science and head more towards kind of art is the idea of facial reconstruction. So truly what somebody looked like. The science side of it is we know physiology, we know where muscle attachments are, and we've got a fairly good idea of how different bone features impact the thickness of muscles, but there's a lot of interpretation and a kind of artistic license that goes into facial reconstruction in terms of just aging the individual. Once they're an adult, and again, unless we know that there's tooth loss or tooth wear, how do you assign an age to that person? You don't know what eye color they have or hair color they have or how they wore their hair. So, the science can only take you so far in terms of actual facial reconstruction.
So the other question, other than physical markers on the body, which helps you to determine the age and the sex and how long the body was in the place that you found, what other factors or other parameters do you look at? Like you talked about insects and the soil. So where is that science advancing for helping us in forensic caseworks?
Oh gosh, a lot. So again, as a forensic archaeologist, my job is to have this kind of like holistic approach. I'm there processing the scene. I'm not there just looking for a body. I'm there to collect evidence of human activity. And so that may be insects or that may be soil or whatever. Forensic entomology, using various insects and arthropods to determine, mainly it's there to determine the time since death.
Okay.
So how long, since that body's been deposited. There are other things that we're starting to do with insects. So we have had some research that is able to find the DNA of the individual inside the gut of the insects. So for whatever reason, the body's not there anymore, but you found some maggots, you could theoretically get DNA from the maggot. Also drug profiles as well. If the individual has overdosed on drugs, those drugs will end up in the maggots or other bugs that are consuming that individual. And we've got a lot of good research detecting all manner of drugs in insects. So there's a lot of interesting research that's still happening in that area. We focus a lot on flies and maggots, but there are other insects that colonize decomposing bodies. So we're starting to get into more research there. one of the areas that I'm very excited about, and again, this is because I'm an archaeologist and I love being outside, but environmental forensics is this huge untapped area here in the United States. It's very kind of robust and well done in Europe and Australia, but we really don't use it enough here in the US. So using soil, using pollen as essentially environmental fingerprints. So if you decided you wanted to bury a dead body in the woods, you're coming into contact with all kinds of plant material as you're dragging that body through the woods. You are coming into contact with soil, not just on the surface, but as you're digging your burial pit, you have to actually stand inside of it. So you're coming into contact with soil that is under the surface, and you're coming into contact with all kinds of different matrices that contain pollen. And that pollen profile is going to be very unique to the environment in which you are. Again, this kind of idea of like an environmental fingerprint. So we have very few people in the United States that are doing this, and very rarely does law enforcement even think that this is a thing that they can do. But again, we've got a lot of models in other countries that show that it is a great resource. It really, it can place an individual at a crime scene and show that there's been contact between that individual and the environment. So it's a huge tool that I hope to see more use of in the US.
That's so interesting. So it's basically using as much evidence that we get from different fields, ultimately for the casework that we all try to find the answers for.
Yeah,
it's so interesting. Coming to other question. So if you find old remains, is there a possibility of getting DNA from the bones, or is this something that you as an anthropologist would look at, or does it go to some other department in forensics that looks at it? How does it work?
So you can get DNA from bone, and you can get DNA from teeth. We've got a lot of good protocols for that. Usually the anthropologist would do the sampling. They would either remove a tooth, or they would actually drill a big chunk of bone, usually from the femur, and then that would be sent to whatever lab has the protocol to extract DNA from bone material. That is not something that is regularly done by, say, a state police laboratory. Usually you have to send that out to some sort of specialist facility. Okay. And it's really only necessary in cases where you just don't have any other way of identifying that individual. And even then, it might not necessarily link you to a particular individual unless you have a reference sample to compare it to.
Right.
Makes sense.
Does forensic genealogy also work closely with forensic anthropology, or?
I mean, this is such a new field, and I personally have mixed feelings about forensic genealogy. But I mean, yeah, in theory, yes, because if you have a set of unknown remains and you develop a genetic profile and you don't have a direct reference sample, then you can compare that genetic profile to other available profiles to see if there's some sort of relationship, familial relationship. So yeah.
Right, because I think it's answering the questions about where the person was, the age, the sex, and to my understanding, genealogy works in a way of like getting linkages between people with the information that they have. So I never knew if it was something that would work together. So my concentration has been DNA. I had to look outside the field.
Well, so there are a number of databases that store information about missing persons. So NamUs is one of the major ones that's out there. So again, if you assemble that biological profile and you have a pretty good idea of, say, the date of when that individual disappeared or was killed, sometimes you can just search the information on some of these missing persons databases to get some possible identification. And then you can go directly to the family and get a reference sample.
Oh, so if through anthropology and archaeology, if you can find features which are matching with someone who has been missing, then you can, yes. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay. So it's like a follow-up thing you do after you have.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think last few questions, as you have studied and worked in a different country and then coming to the US, like you worked in the UK and studied there, and now you're in the US and you're working and teaching. So what are the major differences would you have seen forensically between the two different countries that you think are either helpful to us or helpful to them, or like would be a good combination for both?
I think the two major things that I feel like are done better in the United Kingdom is, first of all, the United Kingdom, I think, uses a wider range of forensic techniques. I feel like here in the United States, everybody wants to jump on the DNA train. I know that's your thing, Nidhi. But
Sorry.
DNA has its limitations. There
Right.
are some contexts in which DNA is not going to be helpful. And there's definitely a level of interpretation when it comes to DNA. But I think in the US, we're just so convinced that DNA will answer all of our problems that we forget about other fields of forensic science. And for
True.
example, in New Jersey, where I live and teach, as people are, as fingerprint examiners are retiring out of the system, they're not always being replaced because fingerprints aren't cool anymore. DNA is cool. And so the resources are going towards more DNA. But fingerprints are a fantastic source of evidence for a whole range of reasons that I won't get into today. But you know, it's something that should still be used prolifically. And I think the United Kingdom definitely does that a lot better. They definitely take fingerprints far more seriously, but they use a wider range of forensic techniques generally. The other thing that I think maybe the United Kingdom does a little bit better is that law enforcement in the UK are very aware of their limitations and they're always seeking help. So they are very actively engaging with researchers and folks at universities to come up with new methods and techniques. That's how we got DNA in the first place. Is there was a case in the UK where they kind of came to a dead end and they read about this professor who come up with this fancy DNA thing and they reached out and that just changed the world, literally changed the world. So I find in the United States that law enforcement is more hesitant to work with external advisors, consultants, researchers, whatever. You know, sometimes for good reasons. Sometimes they reach out and they get burned. You know, they interact with somebody who is not helpful. And so that's going to make them less likely to ever do that in the future. But I would love to see more of a collaborative environment between science and law enforcement in the United States.
Yeah. Well,
Is
fingers
there
crossed.
is there things like anything that's like maybe admissible in court in the UK that's not in the USA or like vice versa? Any techniques, I guess?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm sure there are. You know, I know in the United States, we have had several reports that have talked about the problems with, say, bite mark analysis and using hair analysis, the morphological features of hair, and a few other fields that, you know, really aren't science. However, even though there has been recommendations not to use some of these areas of science, they still end up in US courts, probably more than we would like to admit. In the United Kingdom, I think, you know, there's probably more of a recognition of what can and cannot be done scientifically. Again, it's a smaller country. It's a lot easier to kind of get that information around. So, you know, that's about as specific as I can get.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Just one last question. I'm sorry I've been taking so much of your time.
No, that's okay.
So as you have been teaching and have been a consultant and educator since 2002, and currently the director of the forensic science program, like I mentioned before at Rutgers, what piece of advice would you have for students who either plan to apply for forensic or would want to work or maybe choose forensic as their career in the future?
I think my major piece of advice is to be a scientist first. You've got to know science. So focus on your biology, your chemistry, whatever your home science is first. And then you can convert it into forensic science. Forensic science is just a context. It's just where you practice your science.
True.
So being a good scientist is paramount. So I was an archaeologist long before I was a forensic archaeologist. And, you know, I think the best forensic scientists start in that parent discipline first, because when you run into problems in your work or, you know, a test isn't behaving the way it should, if you don't know the science, there's no way to fix those problems. There's no way to troubleshoot. So you've got to understand what's going on underneath of your standard operating procedure in order to be the most effective forensic scientist you can be.
Yes, that makes sense. Once again, thank you so much. It was such an informative episode. I think it's one of the best episodes we have recorded so far. Thank you.
Definitely. Most informative for sure.
So
Well,
informative.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. I obviously have a great passion for forensic science and for students and for teaching and training. So, I am very happy for you to make my contact details available
Perfect.
to anybody. I'm
Thank
always happy
you.
to answer questions.
Thanks. No, we would definitely do that. And I hope this lures more students into forensic archaeology, anthropology, and like opens the other fields in forensic other than DNA. But thank you once again. And I hope we could connect with you soon. And have a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.